We wear the mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but, O great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but, O the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile, but let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask. That's a poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and I'm reading it mostly because I think it's a good sort of evocation of a concept I want to talk about today that is really important to W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, the concept by Du Bois is this idea of double consciousness. Now, double consciousness is certainly a real thing. I think it's a real thing in basic human psychology, certainly very real to Du Bois, and but really to, I think, every African American experience. Definitely, since slavery times, and it continues on into this day. In fact, most of Claudia Rankine's Citizen, which is a very recent book, deals with the continuing issues of double consciousness that African American citizens in the United States have to face. So it's true now. It was true then. And I do want to talk a little bit about it. Now, double consciousness as a concept is really it's a concept from W.E.B. Du Bois. It first occurred in an essay called "Strivings of the Negro People," and here's a quote from that piece. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-consciousness, manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He does not wish to Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world and Africa. He wouldn't bleach his Negro blood in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. Now, what's so interesting about that really is this simple reality of being other in any society, where you know that you are always subject, and we use this term a lot in literature classes, this idea of being subject to the gaze. That's a big idea. Most of the time we talk about this in gender theory, where women are constantly and always subject to this male gaze, whether the men are there or not, in the way it's extrapolated out into the world on billboards and in advertising, in television, and even in the mirror once it gets subsumed completely. Which is to say that if a woman is looking in the mirror and adjusting her appearance because of a standard that's been set by men, she is subject to the male gaze even when the man is not there, and is therefore always having this kind of secondary consciousness. Now, this is what Du Bois is talking about, only amplified by the issues of race and racism, where he has to recognize that at any time, at any moment, in any circumstances, he is being looked at not just as a man or as a student or as a writer, but as an African American man, student, writer. That loaded into anything he does are these expectations, even for well intended people. Because even even sort of the liberals of his day, and this is true now, have these assumptions that they too have absorbed about African Americans based on racial stereotyping that is 200, 300 years in the making. So there's no way to be separate from that. And it goes even further than that because in America, especially at the time post slavery, there was the quote unquote Negro problem. And so there's this consciousness that even among well meaning people, you are perceived as a problem. What are we going to do with you? How do we solve the problem of you? Now, on some level, we all have a double consciousness. Anyone who has a consciousness of other people looking at them, seeing them, watching them, has this secondary consciousness. There is the you, and there is the you as seen by someone else. But this is the extent to which the other person staring at you has power over you amplifies and amplifies and amplifies this. The extent to which how this other person sees you is based on these large cultural assumptions amplifies this and amplifies this and amplifies this. So you're always a problem. You're never just a human being. You are a black person, or you are a woman, or you are a former slave, and you are a problem. And this is something Du Bois is really trying to explore in his work. And so I really want you to think about that as you're doing some of these other readings, because if you're reading a poem like I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, or the one I just read you by Dunbar, I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, is a beautiful example of this idea of a kind of double consciousness where it's almost impossible to even communicate. Well, why does the cage bird sing? Well, the cage bird doesn't sing because it's happy. That's kind of the point of that poem. The cage bird sings because it's the only way for it to be free. Its voice can travel beyond the bars, and that's the only way. And it also is an attempt to overcome this stereotype of the singing slave who's out in the field singing because he's happy. Well, he's not singing because he's happy, especially when so many of those spirituals were actually about escape and moving to the north. Michael Row the Boat Ashore is not a happy song about how great it is to be working in the fields. It's a sort of coded message about desire, about the River Jordan, which is the River Mississippi, milk and honey on the other side of that river, which is the north. So it's about this desire and longing for freedom, which is constantly suppressed. But the song, which is a song that's desperate for freedom and is in some ways a tragic song, is read as a happy song because of the stereotype that surrounds it and because of the desire of the person listening to read it in a certain way. This is a problem for almost every African American artist in America, and almost every African American artist speaks about it. When the enormous, ridiculous response to Beyonce's halftime show at the Super Bowl is a wonderful example of this. When an African American artist consciously directs their work to an African American audience, it suddenly shocks the white audience into anger and frustration. How dare you write music that doesn't consider me, my ears, my looking at you, and how this affects me? So this is a very potent and powerful idea that's really very important to understanding how art and literature and race intersect. Now today on the discussion board, and don't forget you have a discussion board today, Finish Strong, I'm asking you to think about Du Bois's criticism of Booker T. Washington. And I'm going to do a weird thing, which is it's not so much to take the side of Booker T. Washington because I don't, I just don't. Um, I do want you to understand these two writers in context of their lives. It's a little like trying to make decisions about the attitudes of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, although it's a poor analogy because Martin Luther King is nothing like Booker T. Washington, but there are similarities to this extent. Malcolm X was much more radical than King in his insistence on freedom and didn't understand why, an African American man insisting on his freedom had to simply sit there and get beaten, why he didn't have a right to protect himself. America is based on that idea of right for self defense. And here's King preaching nonviolent resistance. Now, King is doing that, A, because he's a Christian and it's part of his belief system, but B, because he's pragmatic, he's very political, and what he's thinking about is, how do I move and sway people's heart? I'm not going to do that by taking up arms because that feeds into these stereotypes that surrounds me. Remember that double consciousness is always part of his thinking. He has to think not only about what his rights are, but how he will be viewed by this other. The minute an African American picks up a gun or gets violent, he feeds into a stereotype. So to not react violently is a way to not feed into a stereotype and to try to work on the heart of the oppressor, or at least those who might be on his side, to make changes. And it was actually very effective. In that sense, Malcolm X is much more of a radical. In the sense that he really doesn't care about how white people feel about him. He's going to insist on his rights. If you're going to punch me, you're going to get punched right back in the face very hard. And he thinks and of course, most Americans would agree with that point of view. But again, two people coming from very different backgrounds. Malcolm X, urban, had spent some time in prison, was a hustler. King grows up in the South, is a minister. Two very strongly different. One's a bit older than the other. Very different ways of upbringing, very different attitudes to how to survive in the world. That's true about Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. Booker T. Washington grows up and up from slavery depicts this very much in these very harsh conditions where the constant message for him is that he's a dependent, that he's not capable of surviving on his own, that any power he has to be gotten through those who are in power. And he develops this belief system, this non-confrontational sort of core strategy in which what he's going to do is he's going to try to prove to white people that actually we can survive on our own, that we can be good citizens, that we can become educated, that we can do all these things. And so he's trying to play this double game, always conscious of the white person watching, because those are the ones in power. And the only way he can see to get power and to do better in society is through education and extremely hard work, which kind of ignores the fact that in America, the most educated, hardworking black man is still ultimately going to be a black man, especially during his moment in time. Du Bois grew up in New England. He was educated from a very young age. He has no experience with slavery. And he's operating from a slightly different place. He's operating from that, okay, I can get educated. I can prove to everybody that I am capable of everything. I mean, Du Bois was legitimately a genius, and yet still encountering this incredible harsh racism which denies him his humanity on every day. So he is the promise. He is, if Booker T. Washington is right, Du Bois should have access to everything, all of the privileges of being an American citizen, and he is seriously not. In fact, his success only seems to incite and anger the people around him. So you're dealing with two very, very different people, Booker T. Washington has been historically kind of labeled an Uncle Tom, which is like the harshest thing you can say about an African American man, I would say, which means it's someone who's just going to smile and be happy and love on white people and hope that they're nice to them. And from that point of view, it seems somewhat cowardly, but actually, Booker T. Washington, in his own way, is extremely radical and extremely important, laying the groundwork for, for education, even if it was just agrarian education, um, and advancement for African Americans in the United States. He just wasn't capable of moving beyond that. So, um, so when we ask that question of fairness, we have to remember that this concept of double consciousness that is always at play, and this inability to think of oneself as an individual outside of this white context that's always controlling and watching, punishing and rewarding. Um, I hope I articulated that very well. And realizing that ultimately, and this is the other irony of even this lecture, is I'm a white man um, trying to tell you about an experience that I have no access to except through approximation and metaphor. Um, I will never know what it's like to have this experience, and I can explain it to you to the best of my ability, but there are limitations to that, and I certainly am in no position or right to judge it. I hope this is helpful to you in some way. Um, this again, we're wrapping things up. Try to finish strong. I've really enjoyed my time getting to work for you, with you, as your teacher of American literature too. I hope you're having a great summer. Find the off button.